Listen closely because we are diving into a narrative that the establishment has tried to keep off the record for nearly 2 millennia. This is the unvarnished truth that has been waiting for this specific moment in history to resurface. We are talking about reality buried under heavy layers of institutional silence, deliberate reinterpretations, and carefully engineered storylines designed to keep you in the dark. This isn't just some folklore, it is the raw, unfiltered account of the woman who walked shoulder to shoulder with the greatest spiritual revolutionary to ever walk the earth. She witnessed the pivotal, earth-shattering moments of the faith, yet her final chapter was scrubbed from the books. You have to ask yourself, with all the information available to us in 2026, why is the ultimate fate of Mary Magdalene still treated like a state secret? Think about it. She is the first eyewitness to the resurrection, the apostle to the apostles. Yet the moment the curtain closes on the Gospels, she vanishes from the mainstream script like she never existed. What really went down after those events documented in the New Testament? Where did she go when the persecution started heating up in Jerusalem? And here's the real question that keeps the theologians up at night. Why was her passing her final legacy handled with such aggressive silence by the church fathers and the powers that be for centuries? Let's be real, these aren't just random questions popping up out of nowhere. For generations, millions of believers and truth seekers across the globe have felt it in their spirits, that nagging sense that the official report is missing a huge piece of the puzzle. It is a void that the standard Sunday school lesson never filled. And I know you feel it too. Right now, as you are listening to this, there is that restlessness, that spirit of discernment telling you that there is more to the story than what you have been fed. The journey we are embarking on today isn't just about digging up ancient history or dusting off old bones. This is about exposing the machinery of narrative control. It is about understanding how voices are systematically silenced and how uncomfortable power-shifting truths are surgically removed from our collective consciousness. We need to wake up to the fact that the official history is often just the version approved by the winners, one specific angle pushed to serve an agenda, while the real story gets pushed to the margins. It is a version curated for control. Consider this: Mary Magdalene is name-dropped in the canonical Gospels more times than most of the male disciples we celebrate. When the heat was on and the male disciples were scattering like leaves in the wind, she stood her ground at the crucifixion. She was the first one there at the tomb when the stone was rolled away. She was the one commissioned, sent by the Messiah himself to break the biggest news in human history to the brothers who were hiding in fear. Yet watch what happened in the centuries that followed. Her image was hijacked, her reputation dragged through the mud as a penitent sinner, and her true authority and final destination were shrouded in a thick fog of uncertainty. What we are about to unpack here is not some Da Vinci Code fantasy or internet conspiracy theory. We are conducting a forensic investigation based on suppressed ancient traditions manuscripts that survived the purges and the oral histories passed down through bloodlines that refuse to let the truth die. Every single claim we are putting on the table is rooted in verifiable sources or clearly marked as the enduring traditions of the people, the history that survived outside the palace walls. We are dealing with historical receipts and the deep cultural memory that the establishment couldn't erase. As we go deeper into this, understand that our goal isn't to tear down your faith or attack the church. We are here to reclaim a stolen legacy. We are here to amplify a voice that was muted because what she carried was considered too dangerous, too liberating to be left in the hands of the people. Maybe you have sensed it while reading your Bible, that silence between the verses, that feeling that Mary Magdalene knew things, saw things that didn't make the final edit. Maybe you have wondered why a leader of her caliber just drops off the map the moment the ascension happens. Your intuition has been screaming that the story didn't end there, that there was a sequel we were never shown. What if I told you your gut instinct is 100% spot on? That there are documents and traditions that fill in those blanks in ways that will shake your spiritual foundation and expand your understanding of the early movement. The path we are walking today takes us from the dusty streets of first-century Jerusalem all the way to the rugged shores of Provence in southern France. We are going to explore sacred caves, investigate controversial relics that have been hidden in plain sight, and crack open the secret manuscripts and oral testimonies that have weathered the storms of persecution and time. We are going to uncover exactly why the church hierarchy treated Mary Magdalene's death with such extreme caution, handling it with the kind of secrecy usually reserved for national security matters. But before we launch into the deep end, let's get one thing straight. We aren't here for clickbait or sensationalism. We aren't here to spin fairy tales or manufacture drama where there isn't any. The truth is dramatic enough on its own. We stand here as investigators of historical reality, holding space for both the fire of faith and the cold, hard rigor of academic study. Our allegiance is to the facts, to the documented lineage, and to an honest, no-nonsense look at what we can prove and what remains a divine mystery. You are about to find out that the death of Mary Magdalene wasn't just a footnote in a biography. It was a seismic historical event. The ripple effects of how her life ended and how it was covered up shaped the very DNA of Christianity for thousands of years. It dictated how the early church developed how the role of women was systematically dismantled, and how specific spiritual truths were pushed underground. These truths didn't survive in the cathedrals or the official decrees. They survived in the shadows and the margins kept alive by the people who knew the real score. So brace yourself. We are going on a journey that is going to challenge everything you thought was set in stone. We are going to fill in the gaps you didn't even know were missing, and expose why the fate of one of the most powerful figures in spiritual history was kept under wraps for so long. This is the untold story of the tragic yet triumphant end of Mary Magdalene. It is a saga of forced exile, of a faith that could not be broken, of institutional silencing, and of a truth that, despite the best efforts of the empire, rose again. But to truly grasp the mystery surrounding her death, we have to go back to the source and understand how her identity was targeted and twisted by the system. Because let's be clear, the silence regarding her final days wasn't an accident, it was a strategy. We must understand that this was never an accident. It is a calculated piece of a much larger, sinister pattern of systematic erasure and historical reinterpretation. When you actually study the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene stands out as a powerhouse of profound importance. Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, tells us clearly that she was not just present, she was right there with Jesus, and the 12 bankrolling the movement with her own personal wealth. This specific detail is frequently glossed over by traditional teachers, yet it reveals a truth that changes the entire narrative about who she was. She was not merely a passive follower in the crowd, but a woman of substance with independent resources and the autonomy to financially underwrite the entire ministry. But even more significant than her money is the critical role she played during the final, most brutal events of the Messiah's life. When the heat turned up and the majority of the male disciples scattered into the shadows to save their own skins during the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene remained immovable. She stood faithfully at the foot of the cross she bore, witness to the death, she walked the path to the burial, and she was the very first set of eyes to discover the miracle of the empty tomb. In the book of John, chapter 20, verse 18, it is Mary Magdalene who is chosen for the first encounter with the risen Christ, receiving the direct command to break the news to the other disciples. A fundamental role of that magnitude should have guaranteed Mary Magdalene a throne of honor in the history books of the early Christian church. However, history took a dark and twisted turn. In the year 591 AD, Pope Gregory the Great delivered a sermon that would assassinate her character and forever warp the public perception of Mary Magdalene. He stood up and declared that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, and the anonymous sinner mentioned in Luke chapter 7 were all the exact same woman. This was a fabrication. This fusion of identities, which has absolutely zero basis in the gospel texts, stripped Mary Magdalene of her title as a prominent disciple and rebranded her as a repentant wretch. For centuries, the world was force-fed the lie that she was primarily the prostitute, that Jesus saved a narrative that, while powerful for preaching redemption, completely buried her true historical authority. Today, modern academic research is finally pulling back the curtain, demonstrating that this fusion of identities was problematic and intentional from the very beginning. The Gospels clearly distinguish between the different Marys, and nowhere in the text is Mary Magdalene ever identified as a sexual sinner. It is worth noting that the Eastern tradition of the Church never accepted this deception. They refused to accept this confusion of identities, maintaining Mary Magdalene as a distinct and honored figure. So we have to ask, why was this distortion engineered? Deep dives into the structure of the early church suggest there were massive tensions regarding the role of women in spiritual leadership. Some ancient texts, including the Gnostic documents discovered in the sands of Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945, preserve traditions that tell a very different story. These texts show Mary Magdalene in a position of high spiritual leadership, often generating conflict and jealousy among the other disciples. The Gospel of Mary, an apocryphal text that likely dates back to the 2nd century, depicts Mary Magdalene educating the other disciples on spiritual matters. She is shown revealing teachings that Jesus transmitted to her in private secrets he did not share with the men. When Peter questions her authority, Levi, who is probably Matthew, steps up to defend her, checking Peter by saying that the Messiah loved her more than the rest of them. This text, even though it is non-canonical, preserves the echo of real heated tensions that existed within the early Christian community. As the church became institutionalized during the first few centuries, a rigid, predominantly masculine hierarchical structure was consolidated. In this new context, powerful female leadership figures were seen as problematic, inconvenient, and a threat to the order. Historical analysis suggests that shrinking Mary Magdalene's role and distorting her identity served specific interests in the consolidation of male power. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, along with other subsequent councils, drew the lines in the sand regarding which texts would be considered canonical. They decided what stayed and what was excluded. This process, while arguably necessary for doctrinal unity, also meant that many traditions about the early days of Christianity were officially discarded and silenced. Among those discarded traditions were many that preserved the memories and leadership of Mary Magdalene and other powerful women. This is the essential context you need to understand the deafening silence regarding Mary Magdalene's death. If her life and her role were already considered problematic for the official narrative, you better believe her final destiny would not be preserved in the church's records. However, the truth has a way of surviving. Oral and local traditions preserved the stories that the official texts refused to tell. People kept the history alive in the streets. In the region of Provence in France, there are traditions dating back centuries claiming that Mary Magdalene arrived on those shores. These traditions were kept alive not in the official church manuscripts, but in popular memory, in local cults, and in devotional practices that withstood the test of time. The official silence about Mary Magdalene's destiny stands in stark contrast to what we know about the other apostles. We have clear traditions and records regarding the deaths of Peter, Paul, James, and the others. But for Mary Magdalene, only silence in the official texts and fragmented traditions on the margins of history. That silence is not neutral. It is a silence loaded with meaning, a silence that screams louder than written words ever could. It is a void that invites us to investigate more deeply, to question what was preserved and what was deliberately left out of the story. If you have listened this far, it is because you feel the weight of these questions. You understand that recovering these silent stories is not just an academic exercise, but an act of historical justice. If this investigation resonates with your spirit, make sure you join us for the next revelation. We are not here to sell you comfortable lies, microwave theology, or the kind of cheap clickbait sensationalism that floods your timeline to distract the masses. On the contrary, we are locked in together on a relentless mission to uncover the buried historical receipts, to reclaim the full unedited narrative, and to decode exactly how the powers that be manufactured the sanitized versions of history taught in seminaries today. This is not just a history lesson. This is a spiritual excavation, a journey into the deep waters of truth, and you, family, are the most critical piece of this puzzle as we wake up. But before we can even begin to unravel the mystery of her final destination or the prophecy surrounding her, we have to stop and truly understand the identity of the woman known to the world as Mary Magdalene. We have to peel back the centuries of accumulated lies, the deliberate smears, and the theological distortion fields that were designed to keep you blind, because only then can we grasp why her passing was shrouded in such deep, calculated secrecy. Even her name, the Magdalene, is a key that unlocks her identity, pointing us directly to her ancestral roots in Magdala, a thriving, bustling port city situated on the western coastline of the Sea of Galilee. Cutting-edge archaeological digs in our modern era have exposed that Magdala wasn't some dusty backwater. It was a major economic powerhouse in the first century, dominating the fishing industry and serving as a nexus of international trade. This critical piece of intel completely reframes what we read in the scriptures, confirming that this sister wasn't a beggar. She was a woman of independent wealth, holding her own resources and financing the ministry of the Messiah out of her own pocket. When we look at the book of Luke, chapter 8, verse 2, the text explicitly states that Jesus cast out 7 distinct demons from her spirit. Now, in our current year of 2026, many biblical scholars and historians are starting to realize this might not just be spiritual possession, but a description of severe physical or psychological trauma that she was miraculously delivered from. We know the number 7 holds massive weight in Hebraic tradition, symbolizing perfection and completion, which suggests her deliverance was a total holistic restoration of her mind, body, and soul. What remains undeniable is that the moment she was set free, she didn't just walk away. She locked in and became one of the most loyal ride-or-die soldiers in the Messiah's camp. You can check the receipts yourself because all 4 canonical gospel accounts align on the critical facts regarding Mary Magdalene. She was standing right there at the crucifixion when others fled. See Matthew chapter 27, verse 56, Mark chapter 15, verse 40, and John chapter 19, verse 25. She didn't leave him hanging. She witnessed the burial with her own eyes, as recorded in Matthew chapter 27, verse 61, and Mark chapter 15, verse 47, and she was the one pressing her way to the tomb on resurrection morning. You find her faithfulness documented in Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, Mark chapter 16, verse 1, Luke chapter 24, verse 10, and John chapter 21. But the biggest bombshell is that she was the very first human being to witness the resurrection. Now, you have to pause and really let the weight of that sink in, specifically when you analyze the oppressive cultural climate and the patriarchal systems of that era. In the first century judicial system of Judea, a woman's voice was silenced. Her testimony held zero weight in a court of law and was considered invalid by the religious elite. Yet despite this systemic misogyny, the gospel writers refused to change the narrative, consistently preserving Mary Magdalene as the primary witness to the single most earth-shattering event in the Christian faith. This wasn't an accident. It is proof of authenticity, suggesting that the original writers were bound by a historical truth so potent and undeniable that they couldn't edit her out, even though her presence made the story culturally inconvenient for the skeptics. The book of John, chapter 20, verses 11 through 18, gives us the high-definition breakdown of this encounter, showing us the intimate moment between Mary Magdalene and the risen King. She cries out to him, Rabboni, which translates to my master or my teacher, a title dripping with profound spiritual respect and a deep personal connection that goes beyond surface-level religion. And watch what the Messiah does. He doesn't silence her. He commissions her with a command, go to my brothers and tell them an act that flips the script and carries heavy theological implications for the hierarchy. We need to reclaim the definition here because in the early traditions of the faith, an apostle was defined simply and powerfully as one who is sent with a message. So if we are being technically accurate and spiritually honest, Mary Magdalene was literally the first apostle handpicked and deployed by the risen Christ himself before Peter or anyone else got the memo. The eastern branches of the church have never forgotten this, historically honoring her with the title Apostola Apostolorum, which recognizes her as an equal among the brothers. Even Hippolytus of Rome, way back in the 3rd century, wasn't afraid to call it what it was explicitly labeling her, the apostle to the apostles. Understand, family, this wasn't some poetic metaphor or a participation trophy. It was a hard acknowledgement of her foundational rank in the events that birthed the faith we fight for today. When we dig into the archives, we find that some ancient manuscripts that the establishment tried to bury preserve even more layers to Mary Magdalene's story. Take the Gospel of Mary, for instance, a text unearthed in the late 19th century, likely written in the 2nd century, which depicts her boldly comforting the male disciples and sharing wisdom that the Messiah had downloaded directly to her spirit. The text exposes the friction, showing Peter getting in his feelings, doubting that the Messiah would share high-level spiritual intel with a woman over the men. But Levi steps up to check him, saying, if the Savior considered her worthy, who are you to reject her? A line that cuts straight through the ego and patriarchy of the time. Even though the official canon left this text out, it preserves the memory of the very real power struggles and tensions regarding female leadership that rocked the early community of believers. Then you have the Gospel of Philip, another so-called Gnostic text, which drops a controversial passage referring to Mary as Jesus's koinonos, a Greek term that can mean partner, spiritual companion, or heavy associate in the ministry. Of course, suspiciously, the manuscript is damaged right at the most critical part of that sentence, leaving the door wide open for centuries of debate and varied interpretations. But let's keep it 100 and stay grounded in the facts. We have to be crystal clear about what is written and what is speculation. There is no canonical biblical evidence that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married in the earthly sense, despite what the rumors say. That theory has been hyped up by modern fiction and Hollywood movies, but it lacks the receipts in the most reliable historical texts. However, it is equally clear that she held a position of extreme proximity and trust that terrified the status quo. What we can stand on with absolute historical certainty boils down to these undeniable facts regarding her legacy. Mary Magdalene was a woman of substance and independent means, deeply committed to the Messiah present when the heat was on, and divinely selected as the first human eyewitness to the resurrection. She was significant enough to the movement that her name had to be recorded in all four Gospels, a level of distinction that very few disciples ever achieved. This is a rare honor, putting her in an elite bracket of biblical figures who could not be erased from history no matter how hard they tried. When you overlay the cultural matrix of that time, her prominence becomes even more revolutionary, because in first century Judaism, the system was designed to keep women in the background. They were barred from serving as legal witnesses, blocked from studying the deeper Torah mysteries with the rabbis, and systematically excluded from any real positions of religious authority. But Jesus shattered those cultural chains, actively bringing women into his inner circle and entrusting them with heavyweight spiritual assignments that shocked the religious establishment. Mary Magdalene stands today as the ultimate prototype of this breaking of the yoke, representing the most prominent and powerful of these women who helped birth the awakening. When you look at the gospel narratives, you see a powerful circle of women surrounding the ministry. You have Joanna, the wife of Chuza, who managed Herod's household. You have Susanna Mary, the mother of James, and Joseph Salome, and a host of others who were bankrolling the movement. But there is one name that stands above the rest, consistently heading up the roll call in every single list. Mary Magdalene is never just a footnote. She is the headline. The way the texts position her strongly implies that she held a heavyweight title, a position of genuine apostolic leadership among the female disciples that we cannot ignore. And that specific historical prominence makes the radio silence regarding her later years absolutely mind-boggling. You have this massive figure, this tower of faith, and then nothing. You have to ask the hard questions. If she was critical to the resurrection testimony, the very cornerstone of the faith, why was her endgame wiped from the official record? Why wasn't her legacy protected? We have play-by-play accounts of how Peter was crucified and how Paul was beheaded in Rome. We know their finish lines. But for Mary Magdalene, we are left with scraps, whispers, and fragmented local legends. The Answer family ties back to a deep-seated struggle for power in the early days. It is about the friction regarding female leadership and the institutional push to sideline voices that didn't fit the male-dominated hierarchy being built. It came down to politics decisions about which stories to canonize and a systemic discomfort with narratives that challenged the developing structure of the religious institution. Mary Magdalene wasn't just a face in the crowd or a casual supporter. She was a general in the spirit, an eyewitness to the greatest miracle in human history. She was a leader, a fundamental pillar, and a figure who carried distinct spiritual authority in the messy, beautiful early days of the Christian movement. And honestly, it was that very influence that made her a threat. Her story was inconvenient for those trying to consolidate power, so her final chapter was treated with caution and eventually erased from the mainline books. When we wake up to who she really was, we start to understand why her history was handled with kid gloves and why the official church records went mute on her destiny. But the truth has a way of surviving the censors. Deep in the south of France, in the region of Provence, an ancient oral history has been kept alive for centuries, telling a much different story. This isn't just a fairy tale, it is a tradition that has withstood the test of time, speaking of an extraordinary journey Mary Magdalene took after the New Testament curtain closed. Even though the canonized texts left it out, this knowledge was passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, kept alive through local devotion, secret pilgrimages, and the faith of the people. According to this timeline, right after the Ascension, and when the persecution against the saints went vertical in Jerusalem, the heat was on, and a specific group of disciples had to get out of Dodge. We are talking about the Lazarus boat tradition. The group included Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, the mother of James, and John Mary Jacobi, and other key members of the early church remnant. The legend states that their enemies, wanting them dead without getting blood on their hands, threw them into a boat with 0 oars and 0 sails, basically a death sentence by the sea. But God was the captain of that vessel. Against all natural laws, they drifted across the Mediterranean and made a miraculous landfall on the French coast at a place now called Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. To this day, that spot is a massive spiritual hub. It is especially sacred to the Roma people who honor Saint Sarah, also known as Sarah the Black, who tradition says was the Egyptian servant traveling with the Marys. Now, skeptics try to say this was made up in the Middle Ages, but the receipts say otherwise. We find references to this going back to the 5th century. The veneration of Mary Magdalene in Provence wasn't a marketing gimmick. It was rooted in something much older, suggesting these are memories of actual historical events. This tradition is ancient enough and widespread enough that we have to take it seriously as a preservation of history that the official channels tried to bury. After they hit the shore, the team split up to spread the gospel. Mary Magdalene allegedly took to the mountains, moving deep into the interior wildlands of Provence. She spent her final 30 years in a cave known today as La Sainte Baume, living a life of radical prayer, intercession, and solitude high up in the rock face. Is it plausible? Absolutely. We know that trade routes between the Holy Land and southern France were active and bustling in the 1st century. It makes total geographical sense that refugees fleeing the Roman crackdown in Judea would jump on a merchant ship heading west to safety. Furthermore, the way the story describes them, spreading out matches, everything we know about the apostolic mission strategy of the early church, go disperse and teach. But perhaps the biggest green flag is the stubborn persistence of the local people. You don't just invent a specific cave and a specific landing spot for no reason. Local cults aren't usually pulled out of thin air. They are anchored to the land and the memory of the ancestors who actually saw these people walk among them. Generally, these legends preserve the DNA of real trauma and real triumph, even if a few details get embellished over 1,000 years of storytelling. The belief was so strong that in the year 1279, Prince Charles of Salerno ordered a dig beneath the church at Saint-Maximin. And guess what? They claimed to find her actual remains, sarcophagi hidden deep in the earth to protect them from Saracen invaders centuries prior. That discovery exploded the local faith, turning the town into a major pilgrimage site that rivaled even Rome for a period of time. Look, we know the medieval church loved to find relics to boost tourism and revenue. We have to be real about the hustle of that era. Historical analysis is always cautious about these bones, noting that politics often drove these discoveries. However, the key takeaway is that the cult didn't start with the discovery in 1279. The discovery happened because the people had already been worshiping there for centuries. The presence of the tradition long before the excavation suggests that there is a core of truth here that cannot be easily dismissed. What is most fascinating when you peel back the layers isn't just the archaeology, but the resilience of the female narrative in the face of erasure. This massive revelation didn't just sit there gathering dust, it ignited a firestorm of faith that rippled outwards, acting as a catalyst for a spiritual explosion. It absolutely supercharged the local spiritual community, effectively turning Saint-Maximin into a major must-visit powerhouse for pilgrims seeking truth, firmly establishing it on the map of holy sites. Now, when we look at the secular history books and the academic breakdown of these relics, the experts today are extremely hesitant to sign off on this. They tell us there is simply no method to 100% validate these artifacts, reminding us that back in the Middle Ages, finding a holy relic was often just a hustle for political clout and quick cash. There is no denying that these pilgrimages brought serious prestige and a flood of revenue to the local territories. However, here is the key that unlocks the mystery. The fact that this specific cult existed long before the discovery in the year 1279 proves that the oral tradition, the memory of Mary Magdalene's presence in that land, was ancient, deep-rooted, and undeniable. When we look at this through the lens of history and spiritual significance, the most mind-blowing aspect isn't the politics, but the location itself. The real question we need to wrestle with isn't just about carbon dating some ancient relics to see if they're authentic. We need to uncover the spiritual root of why this specific tradition manifested and refused to be silenced. You have to ask yourself, why Provence? Why that specific region on the map, and why center the narrative on Mary Magdalene? Why focus on a story of exile and hiding rather than the glorious martyrdom we see with the male apostles? There are researchers waking up to the fact that this isn't just folklore, but that this tradition likely holds the keys to a suppressed historical memory that the mainstream narrative tries to overlook. We are talking about the remnant members of the early Jerusalem church, specifically the women leaders who were on the front lines, actually fleeing west when the persecution turned deadly. Think about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That wasn't just a bad day. That was a cataclysm that triggered a massive dispersion, scattering the faithful seeds to the four winds. It is more than plausible. It's probable that a group of these Jewish Christians pushed all the way to the Western Mediterranean to keep the flame alive. History is often written by the victors, but the truth hides in the margins. And let's be real about the choice of Mary Magdalene as the anchor of this story. That is huge. It is a deliberate signal to those with eyes to see. If a local community just wanted clout or to invent a fake history for prestige, they would have picked the heavy hitters. Why not claim Peter or Paul? Those are the establishment figures, the central pillars of the official church structure. But no, they chose Magdalene. That tells me this is an independent tradition, a timeline that wasn't manufactured by Rome, but one that preserves real gritty memories of what actually went down. The storyline itself, exile, spiritual isolation. The wilderness season stands in stark contrast to the heroic death narrative. It's unusual, which makes it feel authentic because it lacks that triumphalist conqueror vibe that fabrication usually has. Mary Magdalene isn't being painted as some superhero martyr who defeats death in a public spectacle. That is not the energy being projected here. She is presented as the exile, the one who survives the purge to live in deep, contemplative isolation. She is the prototype of the believer who walks alone with God when the world turns its back. This sober, grounded narrative resonates with the truth. It feels like a reliable historical echo rather than a polished fairy tale designed to sell a religion. At the very least, these traditions are screaming a fundamental truth at us. There was a collective memory that Mary Magdalene survived. She lived her final years far from Jerusalem, holding the line of faith in the toughest conditions imaginable. There is a serious power in this narrative of spiritual perseverance. Staying faithful in isolation is a battle that hits different than dying in a moment of glory. It reflects the reality of the early church and, frankly, the reality for many of us in 2026. It wasn't always about glorious public deaths. Often it was about a silent, steadfast witness while living in hostile territory. I want to pose a question to you, family, because this matters for your walk today. What hits your spirit harder, the dramatic idea of dying a martyr, or the grueling reality of keeping your faith burning while in isolation and exile? Drop a comment below right now. I want to read your genuine reflections on this. What does it truly mean to remain faithful to the Most High when the cameras are off, when there is no applause, when the world doesn't know your name, and it is just you and your inner conviction? Your insights help us decode why the establishment kept certain stories in the spotlight while pushing others like Mary's into the shadows of tradition. Now let's look at the geography because the earth itself tells the story. The Grotto of Saint-Baume, locked away in the Rocky Mountains of Provence, is the stage for this revelation. We are talking about a spot situated roughly 150 meters up a sheer steep cliff. It is one of the most intense and extraordinary locations tied to the Magdalene legacy. According to the traditions kept alive by the locals, the people who were actually there, this is the very grotto where she sought refuge from the empire. They say Mary Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life right here. 30 years of deep contemplation and warfare prayer, and the cave itself, it commands respect. We are looking at a space about 40 meters deep and 25 meters high. It is a gaping maw opening up on a cliff face that is choked with dense wild vegetation. You don't just stroll in here. The access is a steep, rocky path that screams, "Keep out." It emphasizes just how isolated and protected this place was meant to be. Inside the grotto, the atmosphere shifts. It stays constantly cool, and there is a natural water source springing up, which is critical survival logistics for anyone living in prolonged isolation like that. This isn't New Age stuff. Historical records of pilgrims trekking to this specific grotto go back deep, at least to the 5th century. We have the receipts. St. John Cassian, a heavyweight monk and theologian who was active between 360 and 435 AD, explicitly mentions the veneration of Mary Magdalene in this region. This locks it in. It proves that the tradition of her presence here is ancient. It predates the Middle Ages and the church hierarchies that came later. Fast forward to the 13th century, and the Dominican order stepped in to take custody of the site. They built a hospice nearby to handle the influx of truth seekers. They upgraded the path and set up a system of chapels and prayer stations, formalizing the pilgrimage route for the faithful. But notice this, they kept the grotto itself wild. They maintained its natural state to honor the rugged, isolated character of Mary Magdalene's wilderness experience. The tradition tells us she lived in that cave in extreme simplicity. She stripped away the world to dedicate herself entirely to meditating on the divine mysteries she witnessed firsthand. She was one of the few who saw the whole picture, and she spent decades downloading that revelation in silence. Some versions of the story get supernatural, claiming she was sustained by angels who physically lifted her to the heavens 7 times a day to hear the worship of the celestial realm. Now, whether you take that literally or metaphorically, it contains profound mystical symbolism that we need to unpack. It speaks to a memory of intense contemplative spiritual encounters, experiences that go beyond the veil of this physical reality. And look at that number again, 7. That is the exact number of demons cast out of Mary Magdalene when she first met Jesus. That is not a coincidence. In biblical numerology, 7 is the code for completeness, for perfection. It signifies that a cycle has been fully closed. The repetition of the number 7 suggests that her years in the grotto were the completion of her spiritual arc, from deliverance to divine ascension. The work was finished. Choosing a grotto, a cave, as a place for spiritual retreat has deep layers of meaning. It is practical for survival, yes, but it is also spiritually symbolic. We see the cave experience pop up over and over in the biblical narrative. It is a divine pattern. Think about Elijah in the cave at Mount Horeb. That is where he met God, not in the fire, not in the quake, but in the still small voice. The silence of the cave amplifies the voice of God. Look at the Essene communities hiding the scrolls in the caves of Qumran, or the early Christian hermits seeking refuge in the Egyptian desert. The underground church has always been birthed in the caves. This grotto, this cave, represents the womb of the earth itself. It is a symbolic space of dying to the corrupt system of the world and being birthed into a much deeper, heavier spiritual reality that most people never touch. It serves as a literal zone of transformation, a place where the crushing silence and total darkness create an environment for intimacy with the Most High that you simply cannot find amidst the chaos, noise, and distractions of modern society. Think about Mary Magdalene for a second. This is a woman who went through the most radical, earth-shattering transformation a human being could possibly experience. After witnessing the brutal execution and the glorious supernatural resurrection of her master, a cave like this would be the only appropriate place to process, integrate, and meditate on those heavy mysteries. But the ancient tradition also holds on to a very specific detail. It tells us that Mary Magdalene did not walk this path in total isolation. The accounts tell us that she wasn't entirely cut off. She occasionally received visitors sharing the deep teachings and the raw, unfiltered memories of walking with Jesus. Some of the medieval texts go even deeper, claiming that a local man of God, a hermit named Maximin, who would later be canonized as a saint, acted as her confessor and spiritual partner, even though he stayed in his own separate cave nearby. Now, trying to fact-check these specific details with modern tools is basically impossible. The history is too old and the records are too sparse. Yet the fact that this tradition has survived for 2,000 years, along with the incredible specificity of the geography, tells us something vital. It suggests that, at the very least, there is a preserved, suppressed memory that Mary Magdalene, or a powerful matriarch of the early church, absolutely spent time in this region, engaged in deep spiritual warfare and retreat. Over time, this grotto evolved into something much bigger than just a cave. It became a beacon. It stands as a powerful symbol in Christian spirituality, representing the inner work, the journey past, the external religious rituals, and straight into a direct face-to-face encounter with the divine. For Mary Magdalene, who was the first to see the risen Christ, she had already experienced the supernatural. She knew him directly without any priests or mediators, so living in that cave was likely just a natural extension of that raw, unfiltered spiritual intimacy she already possessed. For centuries, seekers and believers have made the trek to this grotto, hungry for their own taste of that spiritual transformation and awakening. Even today, in 2026, that place holds a heavy atmosphere, a quality of silence and presence that is hard to put into words, but hits you like a brick wall the moment you step inside. Whether or not we can prove every historical footnote, the grotto functions as a sacred portal where people can tap into the profound dimensions of their own walk with God. The tradition of the grotto also safeguards a critical memory that we often forget in the West. It reminds us that not every early disciple went out in a blaze of glory or dramatic martyrdom. Some were called to live long lives of silent witness, profound contemplation, and the integration of the mysteries they had seen with their own eyes. We have to understand that this contemplative path, the way of the prayer warrior, is just as legitimate and powerful as the way of the martyr who sheds blood. The exact details surrounding the death of Mary Magdalene remain hidden in the mists of history, shrouded in mystery. However, the traditions kept alive in Provence offer us accounts that, while we can't 100% prove them, deserve our serious attention as the preservation of a lost history. If we follow the most widespread and accepted tradition, it tells us that Mary Magdalene lived in that grotto at Saint-Baume for approximately 30 years deep in prayer and intercession. The story goes that, sensing in her spirit that her time on earth was coming to an end, she finally left the cave and descended to the plains, heading toward a small chapel where Maximine, her spiritual brother, was holding the service. She wasn't fleeing. She was moving with purpose, guided by a prophetic sense of timing to meet her transition. Some versions of this ancient account describe a beautiful scene where she received her final communion directly from the hands of Maximine before passing away peacefully engulfed in a supernatural celestial light. Other versions of the story claim that she actually requested to be carried to that specific spot, knowing she needed to receive the last sacraments before crossing over. This heavy emphasis on the final communion is not just a detail, it is deeply significant because it connects her death back to the beginning. It links her final moment on earth with the Last Supper, an event she would have witnessed decades prior, bringing her journey full circle. The tradition paints a picture not of a tragic martyrdom, but of a tranquil, victorious passage after a lifetime dedicated to contemplation and spiritual battle. This characterization stands in stark contrast to the violent narratives we hear about the other apostles, like Peter being crucified upside down or Paul being beheaded. It makes you ask the question, why would Mary Magdalene be granted such a different, peaceful exit from this world? Why was her ending so radically different from the sword and the cross that claimed the others? Some historical analysts suggest that this difference might actually reflect the reality of the situation on the ground back then. You see, the great Roman persecutions were mostly happening in the big cities, targeting the high-profile leaders who were making noise in the urban centers. Someone living in deep contemplative isolation in a rugged, remote area could effectively fly under the radar, avoiding the Roman authorities and living to a ripe old age. Other scholars propose that this narrative of a peaceful death was a deliberate choice by the local believers to send a message. They wanted to emphasize a different kind of discipleship, one that isn't witnessed through the shedding of blood, but through the steadfast, enduring faithfulness of a prayer warrior over decades. Both forms of witness, the martyr and the mystic, carry profound spiritual value and are essential for the awakening of the body of believers. While the calendar traditionally marks July 22nd as the day she departed from this world, the actual year remains a mystery wrapped in speculation and shadows. Let's do the math on this. If she was walking with the Messiah in her 30s during his ministry, which is a common assumption among scholars, though unproven, and then spent another 3 decades hiding out in Provence, that places her passing right around the window of the year 60 to 70 AEAD, coinciding almost perfectly with the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman legions. You have to understand that timeline isn't just a coincidence. It is a spiritual synchronization that screams for our attention when we look at the bigger picture. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD wasn't just a war. It marked the definitive end of the original authentic Jewish Christian covenant community in the Holy Land. If Mary Magdalene passed away during that chaotic transition, she would have been standing as one of the very last living eyewitnesses to the miracles, the ministry, and the true gospel events. Her passing wasn't just a funeral, it was the definitive shutting of a door on living history, marking the end of the generation that had physically looked into the eyes of the Messiah. Legend and oral tradition tell us that her body was tucked away in a humble, unassuming crypt at San Maxima. The exact coordinates of her resting place would have been common knowledge to the true believers in the area, a sacred site, venerated in secret but kept strictly off the radar to protect her mortal remains during those brutal waves of Roman persecution. You have to understand that this practice of moving in the shadows, this discreet method of burial, was standard operating procedure for the early Christian communities who were living with a target on their backs. But here is where the story gets deep. Tradition suggests that Mary Magdalene deliberately kept her mouth shut about the heavy supernatural mysteries she had witnessed. While the brothers were out there running circuits, preaching on street corners, and building the institution, she chose the inward journey, a path of silence, preserving the raw, unadulterated spiritual download she received from Christ. This conscious decision to choose contemplative silence over the megaphone of public proclamation gives us a clue as to why her narrative was sidelined in the official bureaucratic records of history. It makes sense that the men who were out there debating in the public squares, guys like Peter and Paul, would naturally leave a paper trail and stack up more historical receipts. When you choose the path of the mystic, the path of silent contemplation and internal work, you are not leaving behind the kind of documentary evidence that historians look for. However, we need to pivot and look at this from a different angle because there is another dimension here that changes everything. Fragments of ancient manuscripts hint that Mary Magdalene was holding on to esoteric intel, high-level spiritual technology, and knowledge that was transmitted to her directly by Jesus bypassing the others. Take the Gospel of Mary, for instance. It breaks down profound teachings about the anatomy of spiritual vision and the soul's ascension through the cosmic layers, deep truths she shared with the other disciples who were struggling to catch up. So the million-dollar question is this. If she really held the keys to this advanced knowledge, why was it scrubbed from the record and not preserved for us today? One very real possibility is that this wasn't milk for babies. These teachings were considered meat suitable only for those who had reached a specific level of spiritual maturity and development. The true Christian tradition has always known that you can't cast pearls before swine. There are deeper levels of the game that shouldn't be broadcast indiscriminately to people who aren't ready to handle the frequency. Even the Apostle Paul admitted this strategy in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 2, when he told the church he fed them with milk, not solid food, because they were spiritually immature and couldn't digest the real truth yet. If Mary Magdalene was indeed the guardian of these deep water teachings, then her physical death would have represented a catastrophic loss, not just of an eyewitness, but of a specific spiritual lineage and knowledge base that she couldn't fully download to the next generation before she transitioned. This possibility adds a heavy layer of tragedy to her departure. We aren't just mourning a life that ended, we are mourning the lost wisdom that potentially evaporated the moment she took her last breath. Now, the tradition holds that in her final moments on this earth, Mary Magdalene didn't have fear. She expressed profound gratitude for her journey and made peace with her destiny. She would have affirmed with her spirit that she had completed the assignment that was entrusted to her by the Most High and that she was fully prepared to cross over and reunite with her Master. This narrative of mission accomplished stands in stark contrast to the void we feel today regarding the lost chapters of her teachings, creating a profound paradox that we are still trying to unravel in 2026. On one side of the coin, the tradition paints her exit as peaceful, serene, and spiritually complete. But on the flip side, there has been this nagging feeling echoing through the centuries that we were robbed of something vital, that the full story was censored, and that the crown jewels of her wisdom were left behind in the dust. This paradox might actually be pointing us toward a deeper truth. Maybe the most important things weren't meant to be frozen in ink on parchment. Real spiritual truth isn't always found in a book. It is transmitted through a living presence, through the vibration of an embodied example, and through the power of silent witness. It is entirely possible that Mary Magdalene made a calculated executive decision not to write everything down, trusting that the essential spirit of the message would find its own way to survive through other channels. Therefore, the death of Mary Magdalene isn't just a biological event. It is a spiritual mystery that challenges how we view legacy and truth. It forces us to take a hard look at what we value. Do we worship the text, or do we value the lived wisdom? Do we understand the power of contemplative silence in a religion that became obsessed with written rules and rigid doctrines? What we know, without a shadow of a doubt, is that one of the absolute pillars of early Christianity took her final breath far from home in a foreign land, living in relative isolation away from the spotlight. Her death didn't make the front page. It wasn't widely recorded by the scribes of the day. Her final lectures weren't transcribed for posterity, and her tomb became a quiet spot for local respect, rather than a massive global tourist attraction for pilgrims. That right there is the tragedy of Mary Magdalene's end, not that she died a violent death, but that her passing marked the silencing of a prophetic voice that the early church establishment never figured out how to truly listen to. We are talking about the loss of teachings that could have completely shifted the trajectory of how Christianity developed, marking the beginning of centuries where her true rank and importance were deliberately obscured and distorted by the powers that be. The question we have to square up with today is simple. Why was the death of a heavyweight like Mary Magdalene not documented with the same respect given to the men in the official church records? Why do we have play-by-play accounts and detailed traditions regarding the martyrdoms of Peter, Paul, and James, while Mary Magdalene gets reduced to fragments, whispers, and local folklore? To get to the bottom of this, we have to pull back the curtain on the political structure of the early church and the power struggles that were happening regarding leadership authority and the role of women in the movement. You have to remember, in those first few years right after the resurrection, the Christian community was radically inclusive, breaking all the rules of the Jewish and Greco-Roman cultural norms that tried to keep people in boxes. Even Paul's letters give credit where it's due, mentioning women in high-ranking positions like Phoebe, who is explicitly described as a deaconess in Romans chapter 16. We aren't just talking about her, though. Look at Priscilla teaching Apollos in Acts chapter 18, verse 26, or Junia, who was called outstanding among the apostles, in Romans chapter 16, verse 7. The original blueprint included women in power. However, as the church began to turn into a corporate institution, throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a rigid man-made hierarchy started to crystallize. This new structure wasn't coming from heaven. It was copying the patriarchal dominance of the Greco-Roman societies that Christianity was trying to navigate. If you dig into the academic research on this era, you see a deliberate progressive shift to masculinize the leadership, scrubbing the feminine influence out of ecclesiastical authority. This is where documents like the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, come into play, which many deep scholars believe were written much later to push this specific agenda. These texts, often attributed to Paul, but likely not his handiwork, reflect this growing tendency to shut women down, like in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Verses 11 and 12 declare, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." Now, that position contradicts everything we see in Paul's authentic letters and the actual behavior of women in the Gospels. In this new era of consolidating power and building an institution, strong female leadership figures were suddenly viewed as a massive liability. It wasn't because there was anything spiritually wrong with women. Leading history proves there wasn't, but simply because it was inconvenient. Female authority didn't fit the hierarchical and cultural boxes the church was adopting as it transformed into a formalized, state-approved institution. And Mary Magdalene, she represented the biggest challenge of them all because she wasn't just a leader, she was the apostle to the apostles, the first witness to the resurrection. That is a foundational role that simply could not be deleted from the gospel records, no matter how hard they tried to rewrite history. The tradition was too powerful to erase, so they used a different tactic. They minimized it, contextualized it, and drowned it out with narratives that lifted up male dominance. This is exactly why Pope Gregory the Great, back in the year 591, merged her identity with the nameless sinner. In Luke chapter 7, it was a strategic move. By transforming Mary Magdalene from a key disciple and principal witness into a weeping, repentant sinner, they altered the public perception. This maintained her place in the Christian story, but it stripped her of authority in a way that protected the developing patriarchal structures from being challenged. Think about it. A sinner saved by grace is a beautiful story, but it doesn't threaten male leadership the way a recognized authoritative female apostle does. When you look at the Gnostic manuscripts like the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, you find preserved memories of intense, explicit conflict between Mary Magdalene and Peter. These texts highlight a struggle over who had the authority to teach and who really understood the message of the Messiah. Even if these texts came later and contain different theology, they are likely echoing real historical battles that happened in the early community about the role of women in leadership. So the silence surrounding Mary Magdalene's death isn't necessarily one big secret conspiracy. It is part of a systemic pattern to erase and minimize female figures from official church history. It is the deliberate quieting of half the workforce of the kingdom, burying their contributions under the sands of time. They couldn't scrub her actions during the life of Jesus because the Gospels were already established, but they absolutely could ensure her later destiny wasn't publicized. Her final years and her passing were simply left off the record, allowing the establishment to control the narrative of the early church. There are also some practical realities we have to look at when we analyze why this history went missing. If the legends are true, and she was living in deep contemplative isolation in Provence, she was thousands of miles away from the power hubs like Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, and Alexandria. Passing away in a remote, rugged region meant her death wouldn't generate the same headlines as the leaders who were operating in the major urban centers of the empire. Furthermore, if she chose the path of silence and mysticism instead of active public evangelization, there would naturally be fewer people aware of her presence. Consequently, fewer people would even know when she passed, making it easier for her story to fade into the background. It is a profound irony that the silence she may have sought for her own spiritual walk ultimately became the silence that swallowed the history of her death. But here's another dimension we cannot ignore. What if she was the guardian of deeper esoteric teachings given to her by the Master? Those kinds of mystical insights would have been viewed with extreme suspicion by church leaders who were trying to lock down a rigid orthodox doctrine. They were moving towards strict formulations, and anyone holding a different key was seen as a threat to the unity of the structure. The death of someone holding keys to non-orthodox understanding wasn't something the ecclesiastical authorities wanted to memorialize or broadcast to the world. Remember, the first few centuries were filled with violent, intense debates about the nature of Christ, the mix of humanity and divinity, and the mechanics of salvation. Different Christian factions had radically different views on these fundamental truths, and they were fighting for control of the narrative. It was a war for the soul of the faith, with each side claiming they held the absolute truth while suppressing the others. If Mary Magdalene was associated with a stream of thought that the mainstream church later labeled as heresy, that explains exactly why her memory was handled with such caution. Now, we have to move with real discernment here, family, because we cannot afford to just fall for every simplistic conspiracy theory floating around the internet, as that is exactly how the truth gets discredited. The reality is you are not going to find a smoking gun or evidence of some secret smoke-filled room where church leaders sat down and voted to deliberately erase Mary Magdalene from the history books overnight. What actually took place was far more insidious, a complex, centuries-long historical process where specific narratives were hand-picked to serve an agenda. Certain figures were elevated to maintain power, while others were slowly, systematically marginalized and pushed to the sidelines. And understand this clearly, this systematic erasure was not a tactic used uniquely against Mary Magdalene. This is the same playbook used repeatedly to silence inconvenient truths. A vast amount of the deep spiritual truths of early Christianity were watered down, standardized, or completely minimized as the church transformed from a movement into a political institution seeking control. All that beautiful theological diversity and the raw spiritual practices of the first few centuries were aggressively reduced and filtered out in favor of strict doctrinal uniformity to keep the masses in line. The real tragedy here isn't that there was some group of villains plotting with deliberate ill intent, but rather it is the cold mechanical process of institutionalization itself. As the structure solidified, vital and important voices were effectively silenced, valuable narratives were completely erased from the record, and the raw spiritual richness of the early Christian experience was significantly impoverished. Mary Magdalene became the ultimate symbol of this devastating loss, not because of some Hollywood-style dramatic conspiracy, but due to the ordinary grinding dynamics of power gender politics and the rigid formation of an institution. The heartbreaking result was that one of the most pivotal and important figures to ever walk alongside the Messiah of early Christianity had her legacy twisted and distorted, the details of her death poorly recorded or ignored, and her true historical importance obscured by the fog of dogma for centuries. It is only in the last 100 years, with the breakthroughs in modern biblical criticism and the earth-shattering discovery of ancient manuscripts, that we have finally begun to peel back the layers and recover a more complete, authentic understanding of who she really was. To fully comprehend the magnitude of what may have been lost with Mary Magdalene's death and the subsequent silencing of her memory, we simply cannot rely on the standard narrative. We need to open the vault and examine the ancient texts that preserve traditions about her teachings, particularly those controversial writings that were locked out of the official biblical canon. Let's go back to 1945, when some local Egyptian farmers stumbled upon a ceramic jar buried near the city of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Hidden inside this jar were 52 ancient texts written in Coptic, dating all the way back to the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, though they were likely translated from even older Greek originals. This was not just an archaeological find. This discovery revolutionized our entire understanding of early Christianity, ripping the veil off to reveal the massive theological diversity that thrived in those first few centuries. Buried among these treasures was the Gospel of Mary, a document that holds the receipts on traditions about Mary Magdalene that differ significantly from the official sanitized narrative we were taught. Although this text contains heavy elements of 2nd century Gnostic theology, scholars believe it may preserve older authentic memories about Mary Magdalene's high-ranking role in the early Christian community. In the Gospel of Mary, the scene is set after Jesus' ascension, and the disciples are not celebrating. They are disturbed, weeping, and afraid of what comes next. It is Mary Magdalene who rises up to console them, taking charge and sharing deep teachings that Jesus transmitted to her in private confidence. She breaks down a profound vision about the nature of the soul and its ascent through different spheres of existence, overcoming the cosmic powers and principalities through spiritual knowledge. When she finishes dropping this wisdom, Andrew steps up and expresses serious doubt about her authority. He says, "Say what you think about what she said, but I at least do not believe that the Savior said this, for certainly these teachings are strange ideas to us." Peter then jumps in, adding his own skepticism. Did he really speak with a woman in secret without our knowledge and leave us in the dark? Should we change our customs and all listen to this woman? Did he prefer her to us? Then Levi, who is probably Matthew, responds by defending Mary and checking Peter. "Peter, you have always been impetuous and hot-headed. Now I see you contending against the woman as if she were an adversary or an enemy. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well, and that is exactly why he loved her more than us." This dialogue, even though it comes from a non-canonical and later text, may preserve memories of real tangible tensions that existed in the early community. The characterization of Peter as the one resisting Mary's teaching authority is not a one-time thing. It finds parallels in other ancient texts suggesting that this rivalry was a persistent memory and a real struggle in certain currents of early Christianity. Then, there is the Gospel of Philip, another explosive Nag Hammadi text, which contains a frequently cited but highly controversial passage. In a fragmented section of the manuscript, where holes exist in the papyrus, it reads, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth." Naturally, the rest of the disciples were offended by this display and expressed strong disapproval. They confronted him and said, "Why do you love her more than all of us? What does she have that we don't?" Now it is crucial to note for the record that the parts in brackets are reconstructions by scholars, as the manuscript is physically damaged at those specific points. Furthermore, we have to look at the context of Christian Gnosticism, where the kiss frequently had a sacramental or spiritual meaning and was not necessarily romantic or sexual in nature. The text may well be describing Mary as a recipient of special spiritual knowledge and revelation, rather than implying a romantic relationship in the modern sense. But what these texts preserve, at a minimum, is a powerful historical footprint, a memory that Mary Magdalene occupied a special position of proximity with Jesus, and that this high status generated friction and tensions with the other disciples. This memory is actually consistent with what we see even in the canonical Gospels that everyone reads today. Mary is always close to the action, always present at the most crucial moments of the ministry, and always mentioned first among the lists of women. Another relevant document is the Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Gnostic text that presents Mary Magdalene asking more questions and receiving more teachings than any other disciple, male or female. At one point in the text, Jesus validates her explicitly saying, "Mary, you blessed one whom I will complete in all the mysteries of the heights, speak openly, you whose heart is turned toward the kingdom of heaven more than all your brothers." These texts, although they are non-canonical and contain theology that the Orthodox Church eventually rejected and suppressed, preserve a persistent tradition that refuses to die. They tell us that Mary Magdalene was a bearer of special teachings, of esoteric knowledge, and of a deep wisdom that Jesus transmitted to her directly. This tradition is sufficiently ancient and widespread across different regions to suggest there is a solid historical basis behind it. As we look at this in 2026, what does this mean for truly understanding Mary Magdalene's lost legacy? It points to a much deeper reality, suggesting that she was actually the custodian of a spiritual dimension that the establishment intentionally pushed to the sidelines. We are talking about the blueprint for direct mystical intimacy with the Creator teachings that focus on the soul's inner pilgrimage rather than just reciting a set of religious rules or man-made doctrines. If the legends hold true, and Mary Magdalene did indeed pass away in that secluded grotto in Provence, France, there is a tragedy in that death. Profound kingdom-shaking wisdom may have been buried right there alongside her. And let's be clear, this didn't happen because she was trying to hide the light under a bushel or keep secrets from the faithful. It happened because the cultural and spiritual atmosphere of that era was toxic to the truth she carried. The environment simply wasn't ready to incubate that level of revelation. You have to understand the shift the church was hardening into a rigid pyramid of power, favoring written laws over the moving of the Spirit and prioritizing the institution's control over your personal face-to-face encounter with God. The mantle that Mary Magdalene carried was the exact antithesis of that religious spirit. She represented the raw, unfiltered experience of the divine spiritual authority that doesn't come from a title, but from an internal fire and illumination. This is knowledge birthed from a collision with the holy. Even though this was the heartbeat of the early believers, as time went on, this freedom became viewed as dangerous, suspicious, and was systematically cut out of the picture. So when we speak of Mary Magdalene's forbidden legacy, we aren't talking about some conspiracy of hidden facts about Jesus. We're talking about the suppression of the intuitive, experiential, feminine anointing within the faith. By silencing this, the structural powers effectively muted the mystical heartbeat of the bride, crushing the contemplative spirit that balances the law with love. The removal of this legacy left the body of Christ walking with a limp, spiritually impoverished, and lacking the fullness of the gospel. We lost the vital elements that were meant to keep the institution in check, preventing the church from becoming just another corporation of hierarchy and dry dogma. It is no coincidence that the true generals of the faith, the great Christian mystics throughout history, felt a supernatural connection to Mary Magdalene. Giants of the faith like Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross looked to her as a beacon. They didn't see a sinner. They venerated her as the ultimate prototype of contemplative love and the model for directly experiencing the presence of God. Their spirits resonated with hers because they recognized a fellow guardian of that deep spiritual DNA that completes the religious structure rather than competing with it. I need to pause right here and ask you something personal. I want to know who is standing with us on this journey of uncovering the truth. Go ahead and type your city and nation in the comments section right now. I want to map out exactly how far this awakening for the complete truth has spread across the globe. Listen, this is not just a history lesson. This is a global spiritual awakening regarding narratives that were intentionally silenced to keep you in the dark. Make your presence known, leave your mark below, and declare that you are part of this remnant movement to recover the voices that were stolen from us. The battle over Mary Magdalene's identity, was she a weeping penitent or a foundational apostle, exposes the dark underbelly of how the church hierarchy has historically handled female spiritual authority. Make no mistake, this tension isn't ancient history. It persists to this very day and mirrors the broader struggle over gender power and what true holiness looks like in the kingdom. For the vast majority of the last 1,500 years, the Western tradition painted her into a corner, labeling her primarily as the repentant sinner to strip her of authority. Her feast day, on July 22nd, became a celebration of her saying, "I'm sorry," focusing entirely on her conversion rather than her commission. Look at the art from those eras. She is almost always depicted in tears, hair messy, in dramatic postures of shame and repentance. While that narrative of penitence is theologically beautiful regarding grace, it served as a smokescreen that completely obscured her actual historical assignment. She was transformed into a symbol of mercy and conversion, which is safe, effectively stripping her of her role as an apostolic leader and a teacher of the word. The narrative became about her being saved from sin rather than her being sent with authority to proclaim the resurrection. However, the Eastern tradition refused to drink that Kool-Aid. They never fully adopted the lie that merged Mary Magdalene with the anonymous sinner. The Orthodox Church has held the line, always recognizing her as equal to the apostles, giving her the honor she is due. In the East, her feast day doesn't focus on her past sins, but on her glory as the very first witness to the resurrection and the announcer of the good news. This split screen between the Eastern and Western traditions is massive. It changes everything. It proves that there was never a universal agreement on downgrading her status. It was a choice made by specific men in power. Different branches of the faith held onto different memories, and some refused to let the apostolic nature of her identity be erased. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the cracks in the false narrative started to show as biblical scholars began to dismantle the traditional Western view. These experts proved that the Gospels clearly distinguish between the different women, and there is zero textual evidence to merge Mary Magdalene with the sinner found in Luke chapter 7. This academic breakthrough slowly started to turn the massive ship of church practice around. By 1969, following the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church finally admitted the error and officially separated Mary Magdalene from the anonymous sinner in the liturgy. They had to rewrite the script, reformulating her feast to finally emphasize her role as the witness of the resurrection rather than the weeping penitent. It was a belated move, taking centuries to correct, but it was a significant step toward righting a historical wrong. Then more recently, look at what happened in 2016. Pope Francis elevated her memorial to a full feast day, putting her on the exact same level as the 12 male apostles. The official decree explicitly referred to her as the apostle to the apostles, formally recognizing the fundamental role she played at the inception of the faith. These liturgical changes are not just administrative updates, they are prophetic shifts. They reflect a growing realization within the institution that for centuries the Church failed to do justice to Mary Magdalene, and now the truth is finally demanding center stage. What we are witnessing today is a massive deliberate effort to finally rectify centuries of calculated misinterpretation and the systematic shrinking of a spiritual giant. But we have to ask the hard question that nobody in the pulpits wants to touch. Why did it take nearly 2,000 years for the institution to admit the truth? The answer isn't a mystery. It is buried deep within the corrupt dynamics of gender politics and the hunger for control that hijacked the church's development from the very beginning. For the vast majority of what we call Christian history, women were deliberately locked out of the rooms where decisions were made, barred from teaching the word, and stripped of sacramental authority. They dressed this exclusion up in theological language to make it sound holy, but at its core, it was nothing more than the preservation of a patriarchal culture designed to keep men on the throne. In this kind of controlled environment, admitting that Mary Magdalene was a true apostle sent by the Messiah with full teaching authority was seen as a threat to the entire system. Think about the ramifications if Mary Magdalene was an apostle, if she was the recipient of higher spiritual downloads, and if she carried a specific spiritual authority recognized and validated by the Messiah himself, then the entire argument for banning women from church leadership crumbles to dust. This is the uncomfortable truth that keeps the gatekeepers up at night, especially those who are still fighting tooth and nail to keep women out of the ministry in 2026. Their historical playbook was simple: keep Mary Magdalene as a statue, to be admired, a venerable saint to pray to, but never ever let her be seen as a model for leadership. They were fine with her being a saint, a mystic, or a weeping penitent. Those were safe boxes that didn't threaten the male hierarchy or the status quo. But to fully acknowledge her as an apostle, standing shoulder to shoulder with the 12, with equivalent teaching weight, would destroy the theological foundation they built to silence our sisters. We are living through a time where this spiritual tension has reached a boiling point and has yet to be fully resolved. Even now, as some liturgies finally wake up and call her the apostle to the apostles, you still have denominations in 2026 that refuse to ordain women, exposing their own hypocrisy. It is a glaring logical inconsistency that exposes the man-made nature of these religious rules. If the Savior entrusted Mary Magdalene with the most critical message in history, directly giving her apostolic authority, what right does a modern board of deacons have to say a woman cannot lead? We see the Christian world splitting over this. Some assemblies are waking up, ordaining women, and pointing to Magdalene as the biblical blueprint for female authority in the kingdom. Meanwhile, others are stuck in the past, trying to honor her memory, while simultaneously shutting the door in the faces of women called to preach, creating a spiritual dissonance that cannot hold. But when we strip away the dogma and look at the receipts, what we can affirm with absolute historical certainty is that Mary Magdalene held a position of supreme importance in the early movement, a role that was pivotal to the foundation of the faith. She was the rock-solid witness to the resurrection, validated in all 4 gospel accounts, and explicitly deployed by the Messiah to carry the revelation to the brothers who were hiding in fear. By every technical and spiritual definition of the word, she was an apostle, a sent one, a general in the Spirit. If we are going to be honest about this, we have to admit that the historical minimization of her assignment and the distortion of her identity is a grave injustice, not just to her legacy, but to the truth itself and to the integrity of the entire Christian narrative that has been fed to the masses. Mary Magdalene stands as a challenge to the system, forcing us to examine how narratives are manipulated, how power structures operate, and how the voices of the marginalized are often praised in public while being silenced in policy. She is undeniably a saint, but to reduce her powerful identity down to merely personal holiness while conveniently ignoring her rank and apostolic authority is to participate in the same cover-up that has obscured the true history of the faith for centuries. Then we have the matter of her relics, which adds a whole other layer of complexity, mystery, and intrigue to this ancient puzzle. We have to go back to 1279 during excavations ordered by Prince Charles of Salerno in the crypt of the church at Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, where remains were found and identified as Mary Magdalene. This discovery turned the Basilica of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume into a powerhouse built up between the 13th and 15th centuries to become one of the absolute hubs of pilgrimage in medieval Europe. Finding these relics in 1279 was like a spiritual earthquake. It carried enormous religious weight and shifted the political landscape of the time. The crowds flocking to Saint-Maximin rivaled the massive movements of people going to Santiago de Compostela and Canterbury, showing just how hungry the people were for a connection to her. The official report claims they found the remains in a marble sarcophagus complete with an inscription that specifically identified the bones as belonging to Mary Magdalene. Even more intense, they claimed to find a container holding earth soaked with the Messiah's own blood, which she allegedly carried all the way from Judea to France. Now, from the perspective of modern history and discernment, we have to look at these relics with a healthy dose of skepticism and wisdom. The Middle Ages were notorious for a booming relic industry, where fake artifacts were common, and authenticity was often secondary to profit. Discovering a holy relic was often a strategic move motivated by politics and economics, designed to bring prestige, tourism, and money to a specific region. Furthermore, we know that several different towns across medieval Europe were claiming to have the bones of Mary Magdalene at the same time. Vézelay in Burgundy had established itself as a major pilgrimage center way back in the 11th century, claiming they were the ones holding her sacred remains. The discovery at Saint-Maximin in 1279 was remarkably convenient, as it shifted the center of power to Provence and knocked Vézelay off its pedestal. However, we have to be careful not to completely dismiss the spiritual significance of these sites just because of medieval politics. Whether the biological authenticity holds up or not, these relics represent a powerful continuity of veneration, a chain of memory that stretches back through the ages, proving that the cult of Mary Magdalene at Saint-Maximin didn't just pop up in 1279. The discovery happened at a location that the locals had already regarded as holy ground for a very long time, suggesting that the memory of her presence was stamped on the land itself. When we dig deep into the archaeological record of this site, peeling back the layers of history, we find undeniable proof that a religious powerhouse stood on this holy ground as far back as the 5th century, cementing its ancient roots. This physical evidence completely shatters the mainstream timeline, proving that the veneration and spiritual acknowledgement of Mary Magdalene in this specific region was happening centuries before the Middle Ages even began. The oral traditions and local legends of her presence in Provence are not just old tales. They are ancient foundational truths that have stood the test of time, holding their ground even if the specific relics unearthed in 1279 remain a topic of debate among skeptics. Standing before the Basilica today, you are immediately struck by its overwhelming magnitude, a massive structure that serves as an undeniable testament to the sheer power and spiritual weight Mary Magdalene held in the hearts of medieval believers, a reverence that the history books often try to downplay. This isn't just some small country chapel. It stands as the third largest Gothic sanctuary in all of southern France, a monumental feat of architecture surpassed in size only by the massive cathedrals found in Toulouse and Narbonne. The fact that its construction was bankrolled by the powerful counts of Provence and even the popes of Avignon proves that at the highest levels they could not ignore the undeniable spiritual authority and the cult of Mary Magdalene thriving in that territory. But when you descend into the crypt of the Basilica, the place where these controversial relics are housed, you step into a heavy atmosphere, a space of profound solemnity that commands immediate silence and respect. For hundreds of years, visitors walking into that underground chamber have reported the same thing: a thick, palpable atmosphere, a spiritual density that feels like a living presence watching over the room. It honestly doesn't matter what the carbon dating says. This location functions as a portal, a sacred space where everyday people can bypass the noise of religion and connect with the deepest, most mystical dimensions of their personal faith. Among these treasures is a skull, revered and protected within a golden reliquary sitting alongside other skeletal remains that have been guarded by the faithful for generations. Trying to analyze these bones with modern science in 2026 is a nightmare because centuries of human touch, constant veneration, and handling have contaminated the samples, making it nearly impossible to pin down an exact age or genetic origin. Beyond the science, there are massive ethical lines we have to consider about taking objects that are considered holy vessels of God's power and subjecting them to invasive, destructive laboratory testing just to satisfy a skeptic's curiosity. But if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, what matters historically isn't necessarily whether we can prove these are the literal biological bones of Mary Magdalene, but rather what the relentless, unbroken chain of honor shown to these relics tells us about her true rank in the kingdom and popular devotion. We are talking about millions of hungry souls, pilgrims who have traveled across continents over the last millennium to Saint Maximin, all desperate for a touch, a glimpse, or a connection with the spirit of Mary Magdalene. For these travelers, the relic wasn't just a bone. It was a tangible point of contact, a physical anchor that allowed them to reach across the veil and touch the sacred realm. These bones represented a direct link to someone who had physically touched the Messiah, a woman who was the first witness to the resurrection and who walked in the mysteries and power that modern believers are desperate to understand today. In the grand scheme of things, the scientific authenticity of the object was far less critical than the authenticity of the spiritual encounter, the deliverance, and the breakthrough that these believers experienced when they stood in faith before it. This tradition of guarding the relics also serves a vital function in the kingdom. It preserves the continuity of memory, ensuring that the true history isn't wiped out by the passage of time. Even during the eras when the official church hierarchy tried to silence Mary Magdalene's voice, or when they twisted her identity into that of a sinner to discredit her apostolic authority, the people on the ground refused to let the truth die. When the chaos of the French Revolution erupted, this basilica was stripped of its glory and turned into a supply warehouse, and the enemies of the faith tried to scatter and destroy these holy relics forever. But the remnant, the faithful locals who knew the spiritual value of what they held, snatched up some of the bones and hid them away in secret, protecting them until the reign of terror finally collapsed. That act of defiance, risking their lives to save these bones during such dangerous times, shows just how deeply attached the common people were to this lineage, proving that their connection went far beyond scientific proof and into the realm of spiritual loyalty. Once the dust of the revolution settled, the relics were brought back out of hiding and restored to the basilica, which was reconsecrated to honor the legacy that the enemy tried to erase. The flow of pilgrimage continued through the 19th and 20th centuries, and while the crowds weren't as massive as in the medieval peak, the fire on the altar never went out. Now, as we move through 2026, we are witnessing a massive spiritual awakening, a revival where modern seekers are returning to these ancient paths, looking for the deep lost truths of the Christian faith that Mary Magdalene embodies. High up in the jagged mountains above Saint Maximin lies the Grotto of Saint Baume, a cave that remains a critical pilgrimage site for those willing to pay the price of the climb. Hundreds of thousands of people make that journey every single year, hiking the steep, rugged ascent to the cave, where tradition says Mary Magdalene spent her final 30 years in deep prayer and contemplation. There is a shift in the atmosphere when you enter that grotto, a silence so loud it vibrates in your bones, carrying a power that completely transcends any need for historical textbooks or verification. What these preserved relics and these mountain pilgrimage sites shout to us today is that Mary Magdalene was never truly forgotten, no matter how hard the system tried to bury her legacy. Despite the official blackout on key parts of her story and the institutional silence, the popular devotion of the people kept her memory alive when the structures of power refused to acknowledge her. The pilgrims who marched to Saint Baume century after century and the faithful who bowed before the relics at Saint Maximin, they were the keepers of the flame, refusing to let the light go out. This represents a completely different form of historical preservation, one that doesn't rely on dusty official texts or sanctioned ecclesiastical documents, but lives through devotional practices, oral traditions passed down through bloodlines, and the stubborn faithfulness of local communities that refuse to forget the truth. This is a history written in the blistered feet of pilgrims, in the whispered prayers before ancient bones, and in the supernatural persistence of traditions that survive centuries of cultural upheaval. So whether Mary Magdalene's relics are biologically hers or not is secondary. They are true in a much deeper spiritual sense because they hold the frequency of faith. They stand as silent witnesses to her continuing undeniable importance in the spiritual lives of millions, testifying to the refusal of the common people to accept the official silence and proving the resilience of popular memory against all odds and opposition. When we stand in these holy places or look upon these relics today, we are jumping into a river of memory that has been flowing for nearly 2,000 years. We are connecting not just with a historical figure from the Bible, but we are locking arms with generations of truth seekers who looked at Mary Magdalene and found a model of unshakable faith, of total dedication, and of direct, unfiltered spiritual experience with the divine. The real tragedy here isn't about whether these ancient relics are scientifically authentic or if they pass some carbon dating test. That is looking at the surface while missing the ocean beneath it. The true heartbreak, the absolute catastrophe, is that we are so desperate for physical objects, bones, cloth, dust to remember, a powerhouse figure who should have been the cornerstone of our historical consciousness all along. We are grasping for crumbs because the bread was stolen. It is a tragedy that the official, state-sanctioned memory was so deliberately hollowed out, so fractured and incomplete, that the people had to rely on folklore and underground traditions just to preserve what the institutions tried to bury. The streets remembered what the pulpits conveniently forgot. So we have to ask ourselves a serious question. In the year 2026, what does this massive investigation into Mary Magdalene, her life, her execution, her legacy, and her wiped memory actually mean for us right now? Why is this surfacing? Why should anyone care 2,000 years after the fact that a historical figure was misunderstood or that her dossier was redacted by the powers that be? Why does it matter if the official records were cooked? Here is the cold, hard truth. Mary Magdalene's story is not just ancient history or dusty theology. It is a blueprint for how reality is manufactured, how certain powerful voices are systematically silenced, and how buried truths have a way of clawing their way back to the surface when the time is right. This is about the wars we fight over memory. It is about what society chooses to put on a pedestal and what it chooses to throw down the memory hole. It is about the intentional editing of the human story. It boils down to authority, who holds the pen, who gets to narrate the past, and whose lived experiences are stamped valid, versus whose are tossed aside as heresy. It is about control over the narrative. The resurrection of Mary Magdalene's true narrative, which really only kicked into high gear in the 20th century with the explosion of biblical criticism and the unearthing of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Nag Hammadi Library, is not an accident. It is part of a prophetic unveiling a global movement to restore the voices that the empire tried to crush. And let's be real, we are not just talking about the voices of women here. We are talking about the Black Awakening, the restoration of true Hebrew identity, and the vindication of every group whose history was deemed inconvenient, messy, catchy, or problematic by the architects of the status quo. When we finally wake up and recognize that Mary Magdalene was the very first witness to the resurrection, the apostle to the apostles, and that she held a position of supreme leadership and spiritual authority in the early Messianic community, possibly guarding the deeper esoteric mysteries of the kingdom that the Romanized Church wanted to suppress. When that reality hits, when the weight of that truth settles in, we are forced to completely dismantle and re-examine the foundational lies we have been fed about gender, spiritual authority, and the very structure of the faith itself. Now, don't get it twisted. This re-examination, this shaking of the foundations, is not an attack on the true faith or the Most High. Far from it. On the contrary, this is a restoration. It is a deepening of faith, a return to the roots before the gentrification of the gospel. It is recovering the spiritual dimensions that were looted from us. The movement is not impoverished by acknowledging Mary Magdalene's full heavyweight rank. It is enriched. it gets its power back. Real faith is never threatened by the truth. It feeds on it. It is strengthened by the fire of truth. For women in the faith specifically, and for the awakening community at large, recovering Mary's story is a game changer. It shifts the paradigm. For centuries, the church-industrial complex pushed one image of Mary Magdalene, the repentant sinner, the broken woman, the problem. That was the psychological operation. It was a manufactured model designed to reinforce negative stereotypes, to keep women in check, and to obscure the fact that she was a spiritual giant. It was character assassination, plain and simple. Recovering her real identity as a disciple, a leader, a teacher, and an apostle offers a completely different model, one of power, insight, and divine authority that terrifies religious gatekeepers. But Mary Magdalene's relevance goes way beyond the gender conversation. She is a key to unlocking the prophetic timeline we are living in right now. She represents the mystical, contemplative heart of the faith, the direct connection to the Most High that has been marginalized because institutions can't control it. They swapped spiritual power for building funds and doctrinal handcuffs. Her direct experience of the divine, her path of inner gnosis, her years of silence and downloading from the Spirit, this is the stuff they didn't want you to know was possible. All of this points to a rugged, authentic form of faith that balances out the external ritualistic performance of religion. It is about the internal temple, not the stone one. In this era, in the year 2026, when millions are walking out of the dead institutional churches seeking something real, something that vibrates with truth, Mary Magdalene stands as a prototype within the tradition itself. She proves that you can have a faith that moves mountains without needing a middleman, without needing a hierarchy to validate you. She shows that authority comes from a direct encounter with the sacred, not a certificate from a seminary. Her story is also a masterclass on the nature of historical truth versus propaganda. We are learning the hard way that the official story is rarely the whole story. It is usually just the cover story. The narratives that survived in the margins, the oral traditions kept alive by the grandmothers, the memories transmitted through the struggle of the people, that is where the gold is hidden. These pockets of resistance contain the vital truths that were deliberately edited out of the imperial records. The stone that the builders rejected is becoming the chief cornerstone again. Now, this does not mean we go off the deep end and believe every conspiracy theory on the internet or every YouTube video without receipts. It means we approach history with discernment and humility, realizing that what we were taught in school or Sunday school was incomplete. We have to be ready to pivot when new discoveries smash our old understandings. Just look at the trajectory of how we understand Mary Magdalene over the last 100 years. It is a perfect case study in the lifting of the veil. You have archaeological bombshells like the Nag Hammadi texts, found in 1945, radical shifts in historical analysis, and a forensic re-examination of the scriptures. The earth is literally crying out, revealing what was hidden. All of this has forced a fundamental reevaluation of who she was. The genie is out of the bottle, and this process of uncovering the truth is accelerating in 2026. Every generation is peeling back another layer of the onion, finding new connections, asking better questions. We are connecting the dots between the suppression of women and the suppression of the true tribes. History is not some fixed dead thing in a textbook. It is alive. It is dynamic. It is a battlefield that changes as we bring new eyes and new spiritual tools to the fight. Now I know some of you might feel uncomfortable with this. You might feel that questioning the traditional narrative is like questioning God himself. But let me offer you a different perspective, a kingdom perspective. True faith is never afraid of the truth. If your faith shatters because you learned a history lesson, you didn't have faith in the Creator, you had faith in a system constructed by men. If our spiritual foundation depends on inaccurate, whitewashed, or incomplete fairy tales, then it is a fragile glass house waiting to shatter. But if our faith can handle the heat, if it can grow deeper by embracing the messy, complex, and powerful historical truth, then that is a robust, living, unshakable faith. That is the faith of the end times. Even the Catholic Church had to pivot in 2016, finally elevating Mary Magdalene's feast day to the level of an apostolic feast. They couldn't hold back the tide anymore. That wasn't a betrayal of tradition, it was a confession. It was a correction. It was an admission that for centuries they had it wrong and the truth could no longer be contained. The awakening is here. This capacity to pivot, to look in the mirror and admit we have been walking down the wrong path, is not a flaw. It is the heartbeat of true redemption and institutional survival. When a system or a believer can embrace the raw, unfiltered truth after centuries of error, that is not a sign of weakness. That is the power of the Holy Spirit cleaning house. You have to understand the lifting of the veil regarding Mary Magdalene is just one piece of the puzzle in this massive global wake-up call we are experiencing right now. We are finally waking up to the complexity of our stolen history, realizing that the official narratives were curated by the conquerors and that the voices of the righteous were deliberately muted. We are coming to the realization that the Most High's truth is significantly richer, deeper, and far more profound than the watered-down, simplified versions handed to us by the Roman system. But let's be real, family, this kind of great awakening. It is not comfortable. It is actually painful to have your programmed worldview shattered. You have to start questioning everything the establishment taught you, realizing we were fed incomplete versions of history to hide how power and prejudice manipulated what we know. All of this can be deeply disturbing to your spirit, but it is also the ultimate liberation when we finally reclaim the complete suppressed story of Mary Magdalene. When we do this, we recover a piece of our own stolen identity. We recover a faith that doesn't need a permission slip from corrupt external authorities, but rises straight from the inner man. We are rediscovering the ancient blueprints for spiritual leadership that bring the family together instead of dividing us with man-made walls and exclusions. We are tapping back into those deep, mystical dimensions of spirituality that the modern institutional church tried to bury under dry rules and rationalism. The real tragedy of Mary Magdalene wasn't her physical death. It was the calculated assassination of her character and the martyrdom of her memory by the powers that be. It was the systematic distortion of who she was, the silencing of her prophetic voice, and the deliberate shrinking of her massive legacy. But here's the thing about truth memories that have been recovered carry a supernatural power. They connect us across the ages, bind us to the struggle, and show us possibilities the system thought they had destroyed. Mary Magdalene's true legacy isn't found in dusty relics or tourist traps, no matter how holy people claim those sites to be. It is found in the fire she ignites in all of us today, the remnant who seek the absolute truth, who refuse to swallow the lie, and who insist on amplifying the voices that were cut off. It is found in the powerful example of faithfulness she set for the believers. She stood tall when the men ran in fear. She witnessed the miracle when others were drowning in doubt, and she kept the flame of the gospel burning through decades of dark exile. Her life is a prophetic sign for us in 2026. No matter how long the truth is suppressed by the enemy, it will eventually break the surface. It might take centuries, it might require the blood, sweat, and tears of countless truth seekers, but the truth has an undeniable, unstoppable momentum. It cannot be buried forever. We have reached the climax of this deep dive into the life, death, and erased legacy of Mary Magdalene. And what we uncovered wasn't some cheap tabloid conspiracy. We found something that shakes the foundations of the religious establishment. We found the story of how narratives are weaponized, how prophets are silenced, and how the Most High ensures truth is recovered even after centuries of engineered amnesia. Let's set the record straight. Mary Magdalene was never the repentant streetwalker that the church painted her to be for hundreds of years. She was a disciple, a general in the spirit, the first witness to the resurrection, and quite possibly the guardian of the deeper mysteries that the hierarchy wanted to hide. Her death way out in exile in Provence marked not just the end of a physical life. It potentially marked the loss of the heavy, valuable knowledge she carried, and you better believe the silence surrounding her final destiny was no accident. It was part of a broader pattern to minimize strong figures as the church turned into a corporation and adopted the patriarchal control structures of the Roman world. This silencing had devastating spiritual consequences that we are still dealing with. It impoverished our understanding of the early movement, stripped away the mystical power, and deprived generations of women of a powerful model of spiritual authority. But the story does not end in the silence of the grave. The local people, the folks on the ground, preserved the memories that the official text deleted, and popular devotion kept her importance alive when the institutions turned their back. For centuries, pilgrims have walked those paths to the grottos and basilicas, refusing to let the memory die out. And in our own era, through archaeology and the spirit of revelation hitting the earth, we are finally piecing the full tapestry back together in these last days. This recovery is critical. It matters because truth is the only thing that sets us free. It matters because the voices that were crushed by the system deserve to be heard loud and clear. It matters because your faith is strengthened, not threatened, when you stop fearing the history books and start embracing the complete picture. It matters because every single one of us on this spiritual walk deserves access to the full richness of the tradition, including the parts they tried to hide in the basement. The tragedy isn't how Mary Magdalene died. The tragedy is how her memory was treated by the people who claimed to follow the same Messiah. But there is a massive victory in this story for us today. It is the triumph of truth that refuses to stay buried, of a memory that fights back against forgetting, and of the seekers who will not settle for the official narrative. If this journey hit your spirit, if you feel that recovering these silent stories is part of your mission, then you need to lock arms with this community. Make sure you subscribe to this platform because we are going to keep exploring these topics. We are going after the truths that were marginalized, the narratives they tried to delete, and the spiritual history that opens up our understanding of the end times. I am not here to give you easy answers or empty entertainment. I am here to bring you the raw reality. Here is my solemn vow to you. I am fully dedicated to a ruthless, honest investigation into the Spirit. We will honor every single perspective of faith with dignity, but our absolute allegiance remains bound to the verifiable, undeniable truth of the Most High. I pledge that we will never stop pressing on those uncomfortable questions the world wants to ignore. We are going to shine a piercing light into the cracks of the official stories they feed us, and we are going to resurrect the voices that have been silenced for way too long. The content coming up next on your screen is not just another clip. It is the essential continuation of this prophetic journey. We are peeling back the layers of deception one by one, and you need to see where this path leads. Make sure you click right there because we have barely scratched the surface. There is a depth of knowledge, a wealth of understanding, and a treasure trove of recovered truth just waiting for you to claim it. Don't stop now. Understand this, every single upload is a critical fragment of a massive divine blueprint. We are piecing together the full uncensored history of the Christian walk, embracing all its messy complexity, its spiritual richness, and its beautiful original diversity. Look at Mary Magdalene. She taught us that true faithfulness isn't about chasing clout or seeking the applause of men. It is about standing 10 toes down in your inner conviction, knowing who you are in the Spirit even when the world rejects you. A true witness doesn't always have to be loud, flashy, or dramatic to be effective. Most of the time, the most powerful testimony is found in that silent, contemplative strength, the kind that moves mountains without saying a single word. You cannot bury the truth forever. Even when the powers that be try to suppress it, it will eventually claw its way into the light. Those voices they tried to silence, they are still echoing through the corridors of time, just waiting for a generation bold enough to listen. Make no mistake, family, her story is our story. It is the blueprint for everyone who has been cast aside, misunderstood, yet remains chosen by God. This is the anthem for every single soul refusing to bow to the sanitized official narratives. It is for those who demand to hear the marginalized, the forgotten, and the erased. We know our faith is big enough to handle the raw, uncut reality of historical truth. I truly appreciate you riding with me and seeking wisdom until the very end. Stay vigilant, stay prayerful, and keep your eyes open. I will see you in the next revelation.